On the 2nd of March 1836, the Republic of Texas declared its independence from Mexico. Then, almost a decade later, it applied for membership in the United States of America, becoming the 28th state of the Union. But what if instead of Texas becoming absorbed into the United States, it was the United States that became absorbed into Texas? And then Texas started calling itself the United States, but its capital was still in Austin, and Texans were the dominant culture group in the nation, but Mexicans were also accepted, and also they owned like half of Japan for some reason. Well, if this is the alternate history scenario you've always dreamed of, you'll be happy to hear that this is all possible in Victoria too. And yes, I'm talking about vanilla Victoria too. No mods required. So saddle up and hold on to your cowboy hat, because everything is about to become a lot bigger in Texas. To put things more plainly, in this video I'll be talking about how I reformed the USA as Texas. Something I bet most of you had no idea was even possible. But yes, the USA is in fact a formable country in this game, and is the only formable country that already exists in 1836. Forming it is not entirely simple though, as in order to reform the USA, you must first eliminate the original USA, which is a tall order even at the best of times given their sheer size and the general restrictions to expansion in this game. On top of that, the only independent country in 1836 that is able to do it is Texas, which starts off in a fairly weak and precarious state. Because of this, even an experienced player might struggle to pull it off. Which begs the question, if it's so complicated to reform the USA, why did the devs even bother to implement it in the first place? The answer is that they didn't, or at least not directly. Rather, it's simply a side effect of the fact that the United States counts as a cultural union. In Victoria 2, every culture in the world belongs to a culture group, and every culture group can potentially be assigned one tag to act as a cultural union for that group. In practice, only a minority of all culture groups actually have a cultural union though, including Germany for the Germanic group, Italy for the Italian group, and India for the South Asian group, among others. Cultural unions have a number of unique mechanics, including being eligible for certain events and decisions that check for a cultural union tag within the triggers. One of these is the generic form union decision. This decision is, by default, available to any country whose culture group has a cultural union, and it allows you to form said union if you manage to either own or sphere every one of its core provinces. Since the decision only checks for cultural unions rather than any specific tags, it will automatically apply to every cultural union that doesn't specifically opt out of it. The unions that do opt out include, for example, Germany and Italy, that both have their own unique formation decisions instead, but most of the others use the generic decision. Which brings us to the United States. For whatever reason, the devs decided to designate the US as the union tag for the American culture group. As a result, they technically qualify for the generic form union decision, with the only obstacle being that in order to form them, they must not already exist. So despite never having been explicitly coded, it's nonetheless perfectly possible to form the United States as any country belonging to the American culture group. But just because it's technically possible doesn't mean it's easy to do in practice. So allow me to explain exactly how I managed to pull this off, starting from the beginning. While there are a handful of tags belonging to the American culture group that are able to reform the USA, including California, New England, and, hilariously, the CSA, I decided to go with Texas as it's the only one among these countries that exists on the map at the original start date. Texas is in a bit of a precarious situation though, as you start with only just about 16k total population and are right in the middle of a war for survival against Mexico. Luckily, they have a couple of things going for them as well. First, they start with a ridiculously inflated manpower pool, as over 20% of their total pops are made up of soldiers. This allows them to field no less than 3 full regiments despite their low population, but their ability to reinforce those regiments once they start taking losses is limited. Second, these regiments are led by First President of Texas and God amongst men, General Sam Houston, who counts no less than +6 defense among his stats, the highest defense value possible. Now, the typical way to play Texas is to make use of these distinct advantages to hold off the Mexicans long enough for the United States to intervene on your side and carry you safely across the finish line. While this will ensure your survival, it has the downside that you're unable to gain anything else from the war, as a great power intervention like that removes the ability to add any additional war goals. But if you somehow manage to sign an alliance with the US and call them in as a normal ally, that restriction is not present. As it turns out, this is entirely possible to do, if a bit tricky. The US can only intervene on your side once Mexico has gained at least 1% war score on you, which will happen once they occupy one of your provinces. Through some precise maneuvering, I managed to delay this long enough to use my limited Diplo points to raise my relations with the US by exactly 25, which makes them just barely willing to ally me. Then I simply called them in as normal, added a few war goals, and let them win the war for me. The war goals I added were to conquer the states of Zacatecas and Jalisco. These are some of the highest population states in Mexico and also grant me a Pacific coastline. Conquering states from Mexico is actually quite efficient, because Mexican just so happens to be an accepted culture in Texas, something which I bet will never ever change. This lets me better utilize these pops to raise a few extra regiments, which is very much a necessity since my original Texan regiments are on their last legs at this point. So now that we've built an army and made Mexico pay for it, what are we actually going to do with it? And what's the purpose of that Pacific coastline? The answer to both of those questions is conquer Japan. Or at least like half of it. Now, those of you who watched earlier Vic2 runs of mine might have expected me to go after Korea instead. But the problem with conquering Korea is that you have to fight several battles to wipe out their armies before fully sieging down their country, which will inevitably be a big drain on your soldier pops. Even after my Mexican conquest, I simply don't have the reserves necessary to reliably win against Korea at this point. So instead I have to resort to some more unconventional moves. On paper, Japan is a much tougher foe than Korea could ever be, but they have one glaring weakness: Shikoku, also known as this little island right here. When the war begins, my first move is to drop an army off on this island and occupy one province there. Due to having a navy not made of half-rotten driftwood unlike the Japanese, I'm able to blockade the strait leading to the island to stop the Japanese army from interfering. Once I've occupied one province, I move my ships into port for a few days before moving them out again. During the brief moment when the strait was not blockaded, Japan started moving their entire army toward the island. But since the strait got blockaded again before any of them could cross, the end result is that they all just bunch up next to it instead. Finally, after safely evacuating my army, I once again unblocked the strait, causing all 220,000 plus men of the Japanese army to pour over to Shikoku. They then promptly realized that this kind of response to a single occupied province is just slightly overkill, so most of them start to turn around to head back the way they came, only to find the strait blockaded once more, which leaves the entire rest of the country wide open to occupation. Is this strategy extremely gamey? Yes. Is it absolutely hilarious? Also yes. So after casually walking up to an undefended Edo and demanding the shogun hand over half the country, I'm now able to raise an army large enough to take a few losses without disintegrating, which means it's finally time to get working on my true objective: wipe the USA off the face of the earth. But first, I should probably address what some of you might already be concerned about, namely the fact that all of these rapid conquests have brought me above the infamy limit of 25. So that means I'm just about to get dogpiled by every nation on Earth attempting to contain me. Right? Wrong. As it turns out, the AI is only likely to declare containment wars on you if you're a strategic concern for them, i.e., if you're on the same continent and or share a border with them. Texas is fortunate enough to be located on a continent far from most of the world's powerful nations, and only share a land border with Mexico and the USA. USA is currently my sphere leader and thus couldn't attack me even if they wanted to, and at the same time they are obligated to protect me against anyone who does attack me, such as Mexico. Furthermore, in just a short moment I'll begin declaring my own wars against the US, rendering any containment wars from them less of a threat and more of an opportunity, while Mexico will quickly find themselves far too weak to threaten me at all. Thus, my infamy actually isn't a problem whatsoever, and it never ever will be. Ever. Anyway, after shipping my newly recruited Japanese regiments back to North America, I end up in a bit of a bind, as my only Pacific ports are isolated from the part of my country that borders the US. As such, rather than attempting a perilous transport by sea all the way around South America, I just declare a quick war against Mexico for the sole purpose of allowing my armies to cross through the lands back to Texas proper. Or well, it's actually not the sole purpose, as enforcing a quick war goal on them also grants me enough prestige to comfortably secure my place as a secondary power. This is important, since I can't declare war on the US as long as I'm part of their sphere, but I can only forcefully break free from their sphere if I'm a secondary power. Either way, beating Mexico isn't very difficult at this point, so before too long my armies are in position for the first Texan-American War. The strategy I employed in this war was along the lines of the early to mid-game warfare strategy I outlined in my most recent military strategy guide. I sat back in Texas until the American armies started showing up. Then I used local numerical superiority paired with my best generals to wipe out their armies one at a time. This was made easier thanks to the fact that I had prioritized getting ahead of the US in military tech before the war, and the fact that my godlike defense general Sam Houston had by this time been joined by the very competent attack general Albert Ross, giving me an edge in almost every battle. These two would remain my go-to generals for defensive and offensive battles respectively for most of the run, up until their unfortunate passing. Despite some occasional setbacks, the early battles against the American troops went quite well overall. Surprisingly, the biggest problem in this war turned out to be the US's ally, the USCA, who took advantage of my lack of military access from Mexico to invade and occupy my Mexican territories without me being able to do much about it. I knew I couldn't let that go on for too long, as it would eventually drive up my war exhaustion to untenable levels. So I managed to scrape together a few transports and sent a small army by sea to the USCA's homeland, making landfall just in time before the US Navy could interfere. After a few occupations around their capital, I managed to secure a white peace with the USCA, thus solving that problem. With that out of the way, and the US armies all but annihilated, all that remained was to occupy enough land to enforce my war goals, which is as good a time as any to outline my overall strategy for completely eliminating the USA. These are the territories that the US owns at the start of the game. During the first few years, they and Mexico will compete to claim the uncolonized lands that lie between their borders, which in my game resulted in the US taking these lands. And because of what I can only assume is God's punishment for the hubris of mankind, they also reached up through this little gap in the Canadian border to settle the impeccably named American British Columbia, right next to the even more impeccably named British Columbia. Then there's this one province up in modern day Maine, which starts under the control of the UK but is soon transferred by event over to the USA. Now, normally, the US will then go on to manifest some destiny and gobble up a bunch of Mexico, but thankfully they're only able to get course on this land after annexing Texas, which for obvious reasons is not going to happen in this game. Besides all this North American territory, there's a good chance the US will also annex Hawaii through an event later down the line, which did end up happening in my game. So all in all, this is the territory we'll need to ship away in order to make the United States disappear. It's a lot of land and might seem a bit daunting at first, but there are several ways to make it easier. First, most of the western territories start off as mere colonies, which are significantly cheaper to take than full states. So as far as possible, I will try to take these before the US upgrades them into states. Second, is the realization that you don't actually have to conquer all US territory yourself. All that matters is that the US loses the land. Whether it goes to you or to some other country doesn't matter. With that in mind, I will later on be releasing New England in the east, getting rid of 2 states with 1 war goal, and Colombia in the west, taking care of 4 states with 1 war goal. But the big prize is of course the CSA. They can't be released through a war goal, but what I can do instead is to indirectly support them during the American Civil War by making sure that I'm at war with the USA at the time it breaks out. Without outside help, the CSA is doomed to fail every single time, but if I clear out most of the US armies for them, they'll be able to secure their independence and take a huge chunk of land with them. Of course, that's not going to be relevant in this first war, since we're at least a few years away from when the CSA might declare independence. Well, never mind, I guess we're doing this right now, huh? So yeah, the American Civil War broke out a bit earlier than I had anticipated. But thankfully, I hadn't yet ended my war with the US, so I could just keep that going until the Civil War ended in the Confederacy's favor. When it came time to make my own peace, I focused mostly on taking colonial states for the reasons I explained earlier, but I also went out of my way to take the state of New York as well. This is for one very specific reason. Once France researches the 1850s industrial tech cheap steel, they can take a decision to give the Statue of Liberty to the USA. The Statue of Liberty grants the USA a massive plus 200% immigration attraction modifier, on top of a few other bonuses, and is one of the big reasons they tend to absorb so much immigration compared to other American nations. However, France can only take this decision so long as the US holds the province of New York. So a reliable way to make sure it never happens is to simply conquer New York early on, which nerfs the US while indirectly buffing every other American nation, including Texas. Taking New York at this time does have its downsides though. For one thing, it means I now have an isolated piece of land far from the rest of my country. But also, remember that time I said that going above infamy limit wouldn't be a problem since I don't border any powerful nations that might want to contain me. Well, about that. Yeah, my new Canadian border became an open invitation for the UK to attempt to contain me. However, this isn't as big of a problem as it might initially seem. I already have a military tech advantage over the UK, and aside from the armies already stationed in Canada, the British and their allies will only be sending over a few armies at a time, which I can pick off piecemeal. There's nothing in particular I need from the British, so the main objective of this war was simply to hold out until they would agree to a white peace. In order to reach that point faster, I added Ontario as a war goal. I didn't end up enforcing that war goal in the end, but simply having it meant I could gain ticking war score from occupying that state and thus be able to end the war quicker. What was becoming increasingly apparent by now though was the issue of my country being split into multiple disconnected regions. This made it difficult to move troops around to properly defend any territory that was being invaded. Allowing myself to get occupied for too long is a no-go, because it drives up war exhaustion, which in turn puts a serious damper on my economy and war justification times. To address this problem, I declared yet another war on Mexico, this time with the intention of taking some strategic territory to help connect my various pieces of land. In the end, I couldn't afford a war score to fully connect everything, but I did make some good progress in that direction. Despite the containment war being a huge annoyance, it fortunately didn't hinder my progress much, as I had to wait out my truce with the USA anyway, and I managed to finish all my wars in time to prepare for the next American conquest. But before I get into that, I should perhaps address a few questions that some of you might have been asking, like, why have I not reconquered the cores I have in Mexico, even though doing so would make it much easier to connect my lands there? And how have I been able to take so many states in each war I fought? Well, as it happens, both of these questions have the same answer, because revanchism. I already went into this topic quite thoroughly in my World Conquest explanation video, so you can always check that out if you haven't already. But in short, whenever another country controls your core provinces, you gain something called revanchism. Revanchism increases the rate at which your pops gain support for jingoism, which in turn is required to add additional war goals to an already ongoing war. Specifically, you need an average support of jingoism at 7% or above to add a war goal, a level that is difficult to maintain under normal circumstances. But with the extra jingoism boost gained from revanchism, it's feasible to add multiple war goals in any war you fight. That's why it's crucial that I avoid retaking my cores from Mexico, as doing so would remove my revanchism and make it much harder to gain the necessary jingoism for a rapid conquest of the US. Speaking of rapid conquest of the US, let's get back to that now. When my truce with them ran out, I began justifying a war goal. but since the Americans apparently have a sense of humor, they decided to jump the gun and declare war on me literally one day before my justification would finish. This war started out a bit awkward, as the United States had concentrated almost all their forces around New York, while all of my armies were stuck in the central US. So I had to make a beeline across the continent to defend my little exclave before things got out of hand. But once I got there, things quickly went my way as I beat up the American armies and then proceeded to occupy their territories. Just as last time, the US was allied to the USCA, which I could reach via ships in the Pacific, safely away from the US Navy. After white-piecing the USCA, I continued on to do the same against the US's second ally, Colombia, for good measure. In the Second Texan-American War, I ended up taking Wyoming and North Dakota, which were the last remaining colonial states aside from those that would later be released alongside Colombia, Pennsylvania and Ohio, which served as a starting point for a land bridge to eventually connect my eastern and central US territories, and New Jersey, which I took simply because it was cheap enough to demand that I managed to cram it in there without going above 100 war score. At this point in the run, I've reached a level of power where winning wars is no longer much of a challenge. So now it's just a matter of finding a way to fight as many wars against the US as possible and be as efficient as possible in my choice of war goals. And of course I'm going to have to keep fighting off containment wars from the UK every time our truce is up, but that's only going to get easier over time. I even managed to take the opportunity to steal the state of Ontario from British Canada the second time they attacked me. This state is so large that it almost single-handedly connects New York to the central US, which is why I deemed it worth the effort to annex. But besides peeling off territory from the United States, it's also important to prevent them from regaining previously lost territory from the CSA. Unfortunately, they are very likely to do just that if left to their own devices, since they have cores all over the South, and even after beating them up as much as I have, the Union still tends to outclass the Confederacy in a one-on-one conflict. In fact, they had already managed to snag back one state from the South earlier, so to stop that from happening again, I took the time to put the CSA in my sphere of influence, which meant the US would no longer be able to attack them without going through me. An additional benefit is that it also prevents the CSA from attacking me, something they would otherwise be keen on doing from time to time due to my infamy on our shared borders. For the same reason, I also speared Mexico later. For now though, Mexico had gotten itself speared by the USA, which presented an opportunity for me to circumvent my truce with the latter by attacking the former. The United States dutifully came to the Spearling's aid, allowing me to take both one more state from Mexico to finish connecting my lands there, as well as the states of Minnesota, Indiana, and Hawaii from the USA. By taking Minnesota, I managed to plug in the final gap between North Dakota and Ontario, so all of my North American territories were now fully connected over land. With that, let's have a look at our progress toward our ultimate objective. Out of the states still held by the US, 4 of them will be released to Colombia and 2 of them will be released to New England. Additionally, the CSA actually has several additional cores on the US besides the ones they originally defected with, which they are likely to conquer on their own as long as I keep beating down the US armies. They technically also have cores on the capital state, District of Columbia, but they can't annex that until it's the last state remaining. So in the end, that leaves me with not too many states that I have to annex directly, since the war score cost of these territories only increases the more the total size of the US shrinks. It's still going to take quite a few wars before we're done. Since just sitting around waiting for truces to expire isn't all that exciting, could there be any way to circumvent them? Well, I managed to circumvent one truce earlier by attacking the US ally Mexico. However, this wouldn't work in the later stages of the run, as the US completely ran out of allies and would eventually become too weak to honor call to arms even if they still had some. But fortunately, it would not take long for an even better opportunity to present itself, namely the classic conga line of rebellions. Right around the time I ended my last war against the US, a mob of anarcho-liberal rebels captured Washington DC and soon overthrew the government. This instantly removes all truces that other countries have with the US, allowing me to start justifying and declare another war almost instantly. Not only that, but the truce between the USA and the CSA also went away, so the latter took the opportunity to go for their own war at the same time. Since the US didn't have much time to recover from the last beatdown, these wars ended up being the easiest ones yet. And to really hammer home just how beaten down the US were, I soon discovered that they weren't even the war leader in this war, because that role had been taken by none other than their faithful ally, the USCA. Let me say that again. The USA was so weak at this point that the USCA, of all countries, assumed leadership in the war on account of their superior military. Oh, how the mighty hath fallen. Anyway, after some quick occupations to the north and yet another daring naval invasion of Central America, my enemies were all ready to give up. But I dragged the war out just a little bit longer to ensure that the next batch of rebels, reactionaries this time, could secure their occupation of the American capital. Then I made peace for Illinois and Iowa, while the CSA signed their own peace to retake the state of Kentucky. Shortly thereafter, the reactionaries overthrew the anarcho-liberals, removing all truces once again. But before I could declare my next war, I had to deal with yet another containment war from the United Kingdom. Unwilling to slow down though, I opted to start fighting the US even before finishing with the UK, which honestly wasn't too difficult, given how much the balance of power had shifted in my favor by now. I even toyed with the idea of annexing yet another piece of Canada, but ultimately decided it would be better to end the war earlier with a white peace. Not long after, I also signed peace with the US, taking Wisconsin and Montana along with me, while the CSA grabbed no less than 3 states in a war of their own. Despite the fact that the US still had quite a few Jacobin rebels running around, I unfortunately couldn't rely on them to remove the new truce, since they were mostly concentrated up in New England and were unable to reach the US capital without crossing over my own territory. Rebels can only cross into another country's land if their own country is at war with them, or at least has military access. So these rebels would not get a chance to reach Washington DC until my truce with the US is already up. So this time I just had to wait it out. In the meantime, it's been a while since we last checked in on our possessions in Japan that were so crucial to our early game success. So let's pop over there for a moment and see how things are going. Oh. Well, clearly everything is going just fine there, so back to North America we go. After a couple of slow years, the truce with the United States was finally up so we could once again make some progress toward our objective, and also fight off yet another containment war from the UK. Now the time had finally come to start releasing some of those minor countries that I had held off on so far, starting with Colombia. The reason I waited until now to do this is because the smaller the US becomes, the more expensive each of their states will be to demand in a peace deal. But the war score for liberating a country is always capped at 100, no matter how much their states cost individually. So by saving these liberations for the end, I can effectively demand more than 100 war score worth of states in one go. In the case of Colombia though, it didn't actually end up mattering, since apparently their state still only cost 75 war score combined. But at least New England, which I will release later, did reach the 100 war score cap. At the same time, the CSA also conquered Maryland, their final core state besides Washington DC. During the course of this last war, the American Jacobin rebels that had been stuck up in New England were finally able to cross over my territory, so I had hoped that they would take the opportunity to overthrow the US government for the third time and remove my next truce with them. But sadly, I hadn't factored in that the Jacobins apparently are complete morons, who would rather wander halfway across the continent to occupy some useless backwaters, rather than focusing on the one target that actually matters. You know, the capital of the country. So I decided that waiting around for them to figure out the basics of how to conduct a revolution was hopeless, instead resigning myself to simply waiting for the truce to expire. At this point, there were only 3 war goals left to enforce: an acquired state for Michigan, a liberate country for New England, and finally, conquest to take the District of Columbia. Seeing as truce removal for rebellions can't always be counted on, does this mean we'll have to wait a total of 15 years for the truces between each war to expire? Well, no, we actually don't. But before I can explain that in more detail, I first have to deal with the sudden containment war from the CSA. Remember from earlier when I went out of my way to put the CSA in my sphere specifically to prevent them from doing something like this? Well, with a rapid decline of the USA, combined with their own territorial expansion and quite significant immigration, the CSA had managed to rise to great power status. This freed them from my sphere and allowed them to pull this crap on me right as we're approaching the end of the run. Now, with the British containment wars, I always had the option of just holding out until they would accept the white peace. But for the CSA, that would not be good enough. You see, up until now, I've been entirely focused on eliminating the USA to make it possible for me to reform it. But of course, that's not the only requirement. Once the original USA is out of the picture, we'll also have to own or sphere every US core province before we can take the decision to reform them. A large portion of these core provinces are already under our direct control, but I still have to account for the not insignificant portion owned by the CSA. Directly conquering the CSA will be far too slow and also defeat the purpose of supporting their independence in the first place. So the better option is to simply sphere them instead. I had originally hoped they would remain a secondary power until the end, but due to their untimely delusions of grandeur, I'm now going to have to put the fear of God and country music back in them. Thus, during the remaining few years before my final showdown with the Union, I spent my time thoroughly crushing the Confederacy until they fell back to secondary power, allowing me to eventually enforce an add-to-sphere war goal on them. With the CSA put back in its place, it is now time for the endgame. Like I said, there are 3 war goals I have left to enforce on the US to make them disappear completely. To avoid having to wait for truces to expire in between each of them, I'm simply going to ignore those truces and declare 3 successive wars anyway. The only problem is that in order to break truces in Victoria 2, you need to already have a valid casus belli, but you can't justify any new casus belli while a truce is in effect. The solution is to justify 3 casus bellis in a row, all before the first war starts. I can then declare war using the first war goal, make peace, break truce using the second war goal, make peace again, and then truce break once more, using the third war goal. The only caveat is that I need to finish the first 2 wars as quickly as possible, since a justified war goal only lasts for 1 year. But with how small the United States have become by now, that's not really going to be an issue. So, after justifying the 3 war goals I need, I begin by declaring an acquired state war for Michigan. When that's done, I immediately turn around and declare a liberate country war to release New England. Finally, I declare one last war to dismantle fortifications in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, dismantling fortifications obviously isn't the same thing as a full annexation, so what's that all about? Well, the conquest war goal, which is needed to fully annex someone, can't be justified unless the target only has 1 state remaining. Since I had to justify all 3 war goals while the US still owned several states, I wasn't able to acquire the conquest war goal immediately. But that's really not a problem, because after getting the war started using the dismantled fortification CB, I can simply wait for jingoism to rise to the required threshold and add the conquest war goal then. I could then proceed to hammer in the final nail in the coffin as I annex the last remaining province of the United States of America. With that, there's nothing left to do but click the decision to form the USA. Why isn't it working? Am I missing something? I have to be at peace, but aren't I? Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, you know what, Britain? You want to contain me that badly? Here, you may contain me. Congratulations, you did it. Have a biscuit. Now just leave me alone for 5 minutes, okay? As I was saying, there's nothing left to do but click the decision to form the USA, thus completing a challenge which quite possibly has never been done before. As you gaze upon this new United States that looks pretty much the same as the old one, you might be inclined to ask, is there actually any good reason to do this? The short answer is no, not really. The slightly longer answer is that, technically, this version of the USA does have one advantage over the original, namely that it has Mexican as an accepted culture. But due to the incredibly high assimilation rate of New World nations in general, and of the USA in particular, any non-accepted culture pops will usually assimilate into one of your accepted cultures before long anyway. Or if they don't, they'll quickly get outcompeted by the masses of immigrant pops that definitely will assimilate. So in practice, this acceptance of Mexican doesn't make much of a difference, but could be fun from a roleplay perspective, I suppose. Anyway, that's the story of how Texas destroyed the United States only to become the United States. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a grand old day.